I'm a 27-year-old woman, and for as long as I can remember, my family has cared more about how we look to others than how we actually treat each other. My parents built their lives around keeping up appearances, clean smiles at church, polite conversations at dinner parties, and the idea that good families don't argue. My younger sister, Rachel, grew up perfectly suited to that world. She was charming, spontaneous, and always seemed to know how to make people adore her. I, on the other hand, learned early that being direct or disagreeing meant I was cold or disrespectful. After college, I got a job as a project coordinator for a logistics firm and worked my way up. I liked the stability and predictability of it. Rachel bounced from one idea to the next. One month she was designing jewelry. The next she wanted to start a travel blog. Every time she failed, our parents praised her for being brave and creative. When I mentioned my promotion, they smiled politely but changed the subject to Rachel's latest idea about selling candles online. We still had Sunday dinners at our parents' house every week, but those evenings were exhausting. Rachel would arrive late, throw her arms around everyone, and start telling stories about her week, always just interesting enough to keep the spotlight on her. My mother would beam, my father would nod approvingly, and when it came time for me to talk, they'd ask if I'd found time to relax yet in a tone that felt more like criticism than concern. Rachel often borrowed things from me without asking, clothes, accessories, even my kitchen tools, when she claimed she wanted to cook something special. Half of it never made its way back. When I once brought it up, my parents told me not to be materialistic. Rachel smiled across the table and said I should learn to share like family does. A few months later, I started noticing something different about her behavior. She began complimenting my parents excessively, telling them they looked younger, that everyone envied their relationship, that they had raised us perfectly. At first, it just seemed fake. Then she began slipping in comments about me. If I was quiet at dinner, she'd tell them I'd always had a lot of negative energy lately. When I left early for work the next day, she'd say I was too uptight to enjoy life. My parents didn't argue with her. They just nodded and sighed. When I earned a significant promotion at work, the shift became sharper. Rachel congratulated me in front of everyone but added, "It's amazing how companies are so eager to show diversity these days." It took me a second to realize she was implying my promotion was more about image than merit. I ignored it, but that night at another family gathering, I overheard my aunt gossiping about me, whispering that I was too close to my married boss and that it's how women get ahead these days. I didn't need to ask where it came from. Rachel's words had found their way into the family's rumor circuit. When I confronted her privately, she tilted her head and said she'd just heard it from someone else and was worried about how it looked. The performance was flawless, innocent eyes, a soft tone, and just enough fake concern to make it believable to anyone else. Soon after, I noticed my parents acting differently. My mother's texts became shorter, my father's voice more formal when he called. When I visited, their politeness felt strained, like they were keeping judgment just under the surface. Then one morning, my manager asked me into a meeting. Someone from our extended family, a cousin's husband who worked in a partner company, had mentioned hearing something about me and my boss. I had to sit in front of HR and explain that the rumor was false. I went home that night, realizing that every attempt to defend myself only fed Rachel's story. Words didn't matter anymore, proof did. So I decided to stop reacting. Instead, I began paying close attention. Rachel had a habit of oversharing, recording long voice notes to multiple friends, gossiping in family group chats, and sending exaggerated stories that often circulated widely. She loved hearing herself talk, and I knew that eventually, that love for attention would expose her, so I stopped trying to win anyone over. I started collecting every piece of evidence quietly, messages, screenshots, and voice notes, waiting for the moment her own words would finally show everyone who she really was. After that meeting with HR, I stopped explaining myself to anyone and started watching instead. Rachel had always loved talking about herself, but once I began paying closer attention, I noticed how much she also loved talking about me. Every time we had family gatherings, she'd be glued to her phone, sending voice notes and texts, laughing to herself. It wasn't hard to guess who the topic usually was. A week later, my cousin Julia reached out privately. We weren't very close, so the message caught me off guard. She asked if I was free to talk, and mentioned it was about Rachel. When we finally spoke, Julia told me Rachel had been sending long voice notes in their cousin's group chat, saying I was emotionally unstable and that I made up drama to get attention. Julia said she'd stayed quiet at first, but the things Rachel said recently had crossed a line. According to Julia, Rachel told everyone that I'd once thrown her out of my apartment in the middle of the night because I couldn't handle anyone disagreeing with me. None of that had ever happened. Julia sounded angry on the phone, not just for me, but for being dragged into it. She asked if I wanted her to send me the messages and recordings. I hesitated for a moment before agreeing. That night, Julia forwarded me a set of audio clips and screenshots. Hearing my sister's voice describing me like I was some unstable, controlling person felt strange, not because of the insults, but because of how rehearsed and repetitive her lies sounded. She laughed in one clip about how Emily can't stand not being the favorite, and in another she said, I had to get out of her apartment before she screamed at me again. The whole thing sounded rehearsed, like she'd told the story enough times to believe it herself. I didn't reply to Julia right away. Instead, I saved everything, every message, every audio clip, and started quietly organizing it. Rachel had always relied on her ability to talk circles around everyone. This time, her own words would do the work for me. At the next Sunday dinner, I acted the same as always. Rachel was cheerful, complimenting my mother's cooking and offering to help in the kitchen. She barely looked at me. I noticed how easily she switched between fake kindness and subtle arrogance, depending on who was watching. When When my father mentioned his upcoming retirement, Rachel immediately offered to take charge of planning the celebration. I smiled and told her I'd be happy to help, already knowing what would happen if I gave her space to perform. Over the next week, she sent messages to family friends saying she was handling everything for our father's party because I was too busy with work to care. One of those friends happened to forward one of those messages to me, probably thinking I should know. I didn't respond. I simply added it to a folder I'd labeled receipts. As the planning went on, Rachel started bragging more openly. At dinner one night, she told our parents she'd already contacted a restaurant and decorator. When my father looked surprised and said I'd mentioned booking the same place, she smiled and said, "Oh, I guess she didn't confirm it in time." My parents didn't comment, but my mother gave me a look that said I should just let it go. I kept my calm and let her keep talking. Then came the moment that changed everything. A week before the dinner, Rachel accidentally sent a message to the wrong group chat, the family group chat, instead of her friends. It was a long message mocking me, saying I'd try to make the event about myself and that I'd probably wear something dull and professional again. The message stayed visible for about 10 seconds before it disappeared. A notification popped up saying message deleted, but not before my phone had automatically taken a screenshot from preview mode. A few seconds later, she typed that it was just a joke meant for someone else. My mother replied with a laughing emoji and said, "We know you didn't mean it, sweetheart." My father didn't respond. I said nothing. I simply backed up the screenshot and added it to the folder. The next day, Rachel tried to overcompensate. She called our parents to talk about decorations, sent group messages full of cheerful updates, and even suggested a toast she'd prepared for Dad. I knew she was trying to make everyone forget the slip-up, but the damage had been done. At the dinner itself, she played the perfect role, greeting everyone, taking credit for organizing details that others had handled, and making sure she was always in the center of photos. I stayed polite, keeping my focus on Dad and the guests. Whenever someone thanked her for something I'd done, I smiled and let her take it. Every exaggerated word she spoke just made the difference between us more obvious. By the end of the night, I had everything I needed: her voice mocking me in recordings, her text spreading lies, and her own message proving her attitude in front of our parents. I didn't need to expose her yet. That would only make me look defensive. The goal wasn't revenge, it was patience. When I got home, I transferred all the files to a secure drive and labeled it by date. I didn't know when I'd use them, but I knew there would come a time when she'd push too far again. And this time, I wouldn't have to say a word. 2 weeks after my father's retirement dinner, it was time for my parents' anniversary. I decided to host it myself this year, something I'd never done before. I booked a cozy restaurant, arranged the seating, and ordered a cake from a bakery my mother loved. Everything was confirmed days in advance. The plan was simple: just close family, calm atmosphere, and no unnecessary drama. Rachel, of course, wanted in. The moment she found out, she called our mother and said it wouldn't be fair if she didn't help. My mother hinted that I should let Rachel contribute, but I politely told them everything was already arranged. Rachel didn't take that well. She started sending messages in the family group chat about how she hoped the event wouldn't feel too formal, and that sometimes people forget warmth when they plan things alone. I ignored it and stayed focused on the dinner. On the day itself, I arrived early to make sure everything looked right: the flowers, the cake, the reserved section. My parents showed up a little before everyone else, followed soon after by Rachel. She arrived late, carrying a wrapped box and a big smile, greeting everyone loudly like she was the host. Then came the twist. My cousin Julia and her husband walked in. I hadn't invited them. Rachel clearly hadn't either. Julia later told me she wanted to see something for herself. From the moment everyone sat down, Rachel tried to dominate the evening. She commented on how organized everything was in a tone that didn't sound like a compliment. She leaned close to my mother, whispering things that made her smile tightly and glance at me. When the food came, Rachel told everyone she would have gone with a simpler menu, implying I'd overdone it to impress. Still, I stayed composed. I kept the conversation light, asked my father about his retirement plans, and made sure everyone felt comfortable. For the first hour, things were fine. Then Rachel decided to push her luck. She turned toward my father and said she was so proud of how he'd supported both of us through our ups and downs. Then she added that it must have been hard for him when people at my work started gossiping about me and my boss. The table went silent. My father looked confused. My mother froze mid-bite. Julia set down her fork slowly. My father asked what she meant, and Rachel quickly pretended to backtrack, saying she just meant how stressful rumors can be. I didn't raise my voice. I just asked her calmly where she'd heard such a serious rumor in the first place. She hesitated, looked at me, then said she might have mentioned it to Aunt Linda once, which immediately gave her away. My mother's eyes widened, and Julia quietly reached into her purse. She told the table she had a recording of Rachel admitting she made up the rumor to teach Emily humility. Rachel froze. My father asked what she meant, but Julia didn't explain. She just played one of the recordings on her phone. The sound was clear. Rachel's voice filled the room, laughing as she told someone that she might have exaggerated a bit about my supposed affair so people would stop treating Emily like she's perfect. For a few seconds, no one spoke. My mother's hand was still on her fork, her face pale. My father looked like he didn't know what to say. Rachel's expression shifted fast, from shock to panic to forced tears. She said Julia had edited it, then accused me of hacking her messages. No one believed her. My father quietly asked Julia to send him the recording. My mother tried to say Rachel didn't mean harm, but her voice sounded uncertain. Rachel stood up halfway through the meal, muttering that she felt ambushed. Julia didn't say anything more. She just sat back, watching the fallout. I stayed calm. I didn't defend myself or argue. I just let everything unfold. When the waiter came by, I thanked him, asked for the check, and handled the bill. Rachel left early, slamming the door on her way out. My father stayed silent for the rest of the night. After everyone left, I helped clear the table with my mother, who kept her head down. The restaurant had gone quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy but final. I packed up the leftover cake, handed it to my parents, and walked them to their car. On the way out, my father stopped beside me. He didn't say much, just that he wished things had never come to this. I nodded and told him it wasn't his fault. That night, I didn't post anything, call anyone, or explain the situation to extended family. I didn't have to. Julia's recordings, Rachel's own words, and that dinner had already done everything explanation ever could. By the next morning, a few relatives had already heard. My mother sent a short text saying she needed time to think. My father called later, asking if he could visit me that weekend. Rachel didn't message at all. For the first time in a long time, I didn't need to defend myself or prove anything. Rachel had done all the talking, and now her own words were finally the thing she couldn't talk her way out of. After that anniversary dinner, no one talked about what had happened. My parents didn't bring it up. Julia didn't either, and Rachel pretended like it never existed. But the silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. The next few weeks felt strange. Family chats that were once filled with Rachel's updates suddenly went quiet. When messages did come through, they were short and formal. Word spread faster than I expected. Relatives who once adored Rachel started keeping their distance. Invitations that used to say "bring Rachel too" now just said my name. Family friends stopped tagging her in event photos. No one confronted her directly, but she was clearly being left out. Rachel, of course, tried to flip the story. She started calling relatives, claiming I'd twisted everything to make her look bad. She told people Julia had doctored the recordings and that I'd planned the dinner to humiliate her, but each attempt only made her sound more desperate and less believable. I didn't have to correct anything. The truth already existed in her own words, and my silence made her look smaller every time she spoke. My father began calling me more often. It wasn't to talk about the situation, just regular check-ins about work, groceries, and traffic, but I could tell it was his way of rebuilding connection. My mother, on the other hand, had grown cautious. She asked polite questions when we spoke, but avoided anything personal. It was as if she didn't know how to navigate a world where Rachel wasn't the perfect daughter anymore. At work, things were going better than ever. I received a regional performance award and a feature in my company's newsletter. Photos from the ceremony ended up in family group chats, sent by a distant aunt who followed my firm online. The comments that followed were full of congratulations, except for Rachel's silence. Later, I found out she'd told a cousin that corporate people love giving themselves trophies. A month later, my company hosted a charity event for a local children's hospital, and I was one of the coordinators. We needed volunteers for the registration desk, so I invited my parents to attend. My father agreed right away. My mother asked if Rachel could come too. I explained honestly that all the participant spots were already filled. She didn't argue, but I could hear the disappointment in her voice. The event turned out better than I could have hoped. The company's regional director attended, and local news covered it briefly. My parents watched as I handled everything, coordinating speakers, greeting guests, keeping the schedule on track. They stood near the back, quiet and observant. I didn't need to look their way to know they saw a side of me they hadn't noticed before. After the event, my father told me he was proud. On the drive home, he admitted he'd believed things too quickly in the past. He didn't mention Rachel directly, but the message was clear. My mother nodded quietly beside him. It was the closest thing to acknowledgement I'd ever received from either of them. That night, Rachel sent a string of messages. She accused me of embarrassing her by not inviting her to the event, said I'd made her look useless, and even blamed me for her friends distancing themselves. Her tone bounced between anger and guilt. I didn't respond. I didn't delete the messages either. I just archived them and went to bed. The next morning, my father called again. He told me Rachel had been crying and blaming me for everything that was happening. He didn't defend her, but he sounded tired. He said he'd asked her to stop making excuses and start taking responsibility. Later, my mother called too. She didn't scold me, but she said Rachel was too emotional to handle guilt, and that I should try to understand. I told her I had nothing left to argue about and ended the call politely. In the weeks that followed, the divide between them became clear. My father began spending more time at his office, even after retirement, visiting old colleagues. My mother stayed home and kept calling Rachel. Every time I visited, I could feel the tension between them. My father spoke about ordinary things, car maintenance, garden repairs, neighborhood news, while my mother spoke softly about family healing. Rachel's absence became noticeable. Her name stopped appearing in group chats, her social invitations disappeared, and even the relatives who once called her the lively one started referring to her as distant. It wasn't dramatic, just a slow erasure of the image she had built for years. A few of our mutual friends later told me she'd been trying to convince people she was misunderstood, but the more she talked, the more she revealed how much of it had been built on lies. Every explanation only reminded people of what they'd already heard in her own recordings. For the first time, she wasn't the one controlling the story. The attention she'd spent years fighting for had turned quiet, and no one rushed to fill it. I didn't confront her or push for an apology. I didn't need to. The balance had finally shifted, not because I exposed her again, but because she finally ran out of stories that anyone was willing to believe. A month after the dinner, Rachel started what looked like a full-blown campaign to fix her image. She showed up at relatives' houses with small gifts, wrote long, sentimental posts about gratitude and forgiveness, and volunteered for every neighborhood committee she could find. She sent cheerful messages to family chats, complimented everyone's cooking, and even helped organize a cousin's baby shower. It might have looked genuine to a stranger, but anyone who'd seen the pattern before could tell it was all for show. She tried too hard. Her smiles lasted a little too long, her compliments sounded rehearsed, and her apologies came out of nowhere. People accepted her gestures politely, but most just nodded and moved on. The enthusiasm never stuck. It was the kind of charm that worked only when no one knew what she'd done. My mother told me she felt sorry for her. She said Rachel was just trying to find her way back into everyone's good graces and that I should see the effort she's making. I didn't argue. I kept my focus on work and my own life. I'd started going out more with colleagues, taking weekend trips, and joining a few professional events that had nothing to do with family. It was easier that way, no drama, no comparisons. Then Rachel found a new angle. She started contacting people in my circle, old classmates, mutual acquaintances, even my close friend Claire. She talked about rebuilding sisterhood and how she wanted to make peace with the past. At first, Claire thought she was being sincere, until Rachel started asking personal questions. She wanted to know where I'd been going on weekends, who I'd been spending time with, and whether I was seeing someone. Claire didn't answer any of it. She just took screenshots and sent them to me. When word got around that Rachel was reaching out to people behind my back, her plan began to crumble again. She was telling different stories to different people. To some, she said we were slowly reconnecting, while to others, she said I'd cut her off completely. The mixed messages spread fast. Relatives started asking each other what was really happening, and before long, people stopped engaging with her altogether. One of our mother's friends eventually stepped in. She called my mother privately and told her Rachel was still gossiping, this time about me and Claire, while pretending she'd changed. That conversation shook something in my mother. When she mentioned it to me later, her tone was different. For the first time, she didn't defend Rachel right away. She just sighed and said, maybe she does exaggerate things. A week later, my father decided he'd had enough. He called both of us to his office at home and said it was time to clear the air once and for all. I didn't argue or refuse. I just showed up. Rachel arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a bright dress and carrying a tissue in her hand like she was ready for a performance. My father started by saying he didn't want accusations, just honesty. Rachel immediately began crying, talking about how misunderstood she'd been. She said she'd only acted out because she felt pressure to be perfect, that people had always compared her to me, and that it made her feel invisible. She told him she was trying to be better and wanted the family to forgive her mistakes. When she finished, I took out a small folder I'd brought with me. Inside were screenshots and printouts of her latest messages, ones where she'd been talking about me to family friends while claiming she'd changed. I placed them on my father's desk without saying much. The timestamps and chat names spoke for themselves. My father read through them silently. He didn't raise his voice or say anything dramatic. He just looked at Rachel and asked if they were real. She hesitated before nodding. He told her that being sorry didn't mean much when her behavior never changed. He said accountability mattered more than excuses or performances. Rachel tried to argue that I was making her look bad again, but the moment had already passed. My mother sat on the couch, watching quietly, no longer jumping to defend her. The usual sympathy in her eyes wasn't there this time, just exhaustion. Rachel stood up, said she was done with everyone treating her like the villain, and left the room before my father could finish speaking. The sound of the door closing was the only noise for a while. My father leaned back in his chair and didn't say another word. My mother stayed seated, staring at the folder on the desk. I didn't stay long after that. I picked up my things, thanked my father for listening, and walked out. There was nothing left to explain. The conversation hadn't been dramatic or emotional, but it had done what years of arguing never could. From that day on, things felt different. The illusion that Rachel could talk her way out of anything was gone. People no longer believed her version first. For the first time, she wasn't the one steering the family's story, and I didn't need to expose her anymore. The truth had already started doing that for me. The weeks after that meeting were quiet. Rachel stopped reaching out, and the family group chat went silent again. My father only sent occasional updates about home repairs or local news, and my mother avoided mentioning either of us in conversation. The calm wasn't comfortable, but it was steady, a kind of silence that came after too many years of pretending nothing was wrong. At dinners, Rachel no longer showed up. My father would set an extra plate for her out of habit, but it stayed untouched. My mother still sent her leftovers afterward, though she stopped defending her decisions out loud. When relatives asked about her, my parents gave short, neutral answers. Everyone could sense something had shifted. I kept my focus on work and routines. My company had expanded its regional operations, and I'd been assigned to oversee new project teams. It kept me busy, and more importantly, it gave me distance. Every few weeks, my father invited me to lunch. Nothing heavy, just simple meals at a diner near his office. He'd ask about work, about my friends, and sometimes about my apartment. Each time, he ended with the same sentence: "I'm glad you're doing well." One afternoon, during one of those lunches, he mentioned that Rachel had been struggling to find steady work. He said she'd applied to a few marketing jobs but hadn't passed the background checks because of references that didn't go as planned. I stayed quiet. It wasn't my place to add to it. A few days later, I ran into Rachel unexpectedly at a cafe downtown. She looked tired, pale, anxious, with the kind of restlessness that doesn't fade easily. She spotted me before I could leave and walked over, holding her coffee cup like a shield. She said she'd been thinking about reaching out but didn't know how. I told her there was nothing to explain. We talked for a few minutes. Her tone wasn't angry anymore. It was weary. She admitted she'd been rejected from 3 jobs in a row and that people remembered stories. I didn't need to ask which stories she meant. She said she wanted to start over somewhere new. I nodded and told her that might be a good idea. Before she left, I mentioned that a sister company of mine had an opening for administrative work. It wasn't a big position, but it was stable. She looked surprised and thanked me. I didn't promise anything. I just told her to apply through the normal process. 2 weeks later, HR from that company called to verify her reference. I gave an honest answer, that she was talented but had struggled with reliability and interpersonal boundaries. They thanked me and said they appreciated the transparency. A week later, I heard she hadn't been selected. Rachel didn't contact me after that. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard she'd taken a temporary job at a local boutique and was keeping to herself. She'd stopped posting online, stopped calling relatives, and seemed to be living quietly for once. My father told me one evening that Rachel had come by the house to help my mother with groceries. He said she didn't stay long, but she'd been polite and calm. My mother, according to him, had started to soften toward both of us again. She cooked small family dinners occasionally, though now they were simpler, quieter. When I visited one Sunday, Rachel wasn't there. My mother mentioned that she'd been volunteering at a nearby community center. It wasn't said with pride or guilt, just as a fact. My father changed the subject quickly, asking me about a work trip I had planned. That's how things stayed for a while. Rachel kept her distance, and so did I. There were no confrontations, no forced apologies, no grand reconciliations. Just space, the kind that finally let everyone stop pretending. Months later, during a small family gathering for my father's birthday, Rachel showed up. It was the first time we'd been in the same room since that day in his office. She greeted me quietly and handed my parents a wrapped box with a store-bought cake inside. No one made a scene. Dinner went smoothly. Rachel stayed polite, helped clear the table, and left early. On her way out, she gave me a small nod. Not quite a smile, not quite an apology, just acknowledgement. My father noticed and didn't say a word. After they left, my mother said it was nice that everyone could be civil again. I agreed. It wasn't forgiveness or closure, but it was peace. The kind that doesn't need to be announced. Over time, I noticed how the house itself changed. The framed photos on the living room wall shifted. A few of Rachel, a few of me, spaced evenly for once. My father started inviting both of us separately. Instead of choosing sides, my mother stopped referring to either of us as the difficult or sensitive one. It was as if the family had quietly rebuilt itself. Not by fixing what broke, but by accepting that it had broken at all. Now, when I think about everything that happened, there's no satisfaction or bitterness left. Rachel's downfall didn't come from anything I did. It came from her own choices. And her quiet recovery, whatever form it takes, belongs to her too. As for me, I learned that sometimes the most powerful response isn't a confrontation or a revenge plan. It's silence, patience, and the decision to stop playing a game you never wanted to be part of in the first place. Months passed, and life finally settled into something steady. Work stayed busy but manageable. The same small group of friends filled my weekends, and my days didn't revolve around the next family issue. For the first time in years, everything felt simple. There were no late-night calls, no whispered updates about Rachel, no unexpected messages stirring up drama. The quiet felt unfamiliar, but it stayed. Rachel had pulled back completely. She didn't show up to dinners, and no one mentioned her much anymore. My father still spoke to her occasionally, but the updates were brief. How she was doing at work, how she'd been helping at a local community center, and that she'd been keeping to herself. My mother mentioned her even less, though small things hinted at a change. She started asking me about my week without trying to compare it to Rachel's. When I talked about work, she listened instead of offering backhanded advice. It was the kind of calm that had never existed in our family before. One night, my father called and asked if I'd be open to meeting Rachel. He said it wasn't about fixing anything, she just wanted to talk. He made it clear there'd be no confrontation, no arguments, just a conversation she'd asked for. I thought about it for a few days before agreeing. I told him it needed to happen in a public place, and that I wasn't doing it to reconcile, only to close whatever was still open. We met at a quiet cafe near the old park we used to visit as kids. Rachel was already there when I arrived, sitting by the window with her hands folded. She looked different, tired but calmer, her usual restless energy gone. When I sat down, she thanked me for coming, her voice steady but unsure. The first few minutes were small talk. She asked about work, about our parents, about things that didn't really need answers. Then, without much build-up, she said she wanted to apologize. She admitted she had been cruel, that the things she'd said and done weren't about hate, but about needing control. She said she'd spent years feeling invisible, and making me look bad had been her way of feeling powerful. Her voice shook when she said it out loud. There were no tears this time, no dramatics. She didn't try to justify it with excuses about pressure or jealousy. She said she'd spent months replaying everything, realizing it wasn't about our parents choosing sides. It was about her needing to be the center of attention and not knowing who she was without it. I listened, and when she finished, I told her I accepted the apology. I also told her it didn't mean things would go back to how they were. Trust wasn't a light switch. It took time, if it could return at all. She nodded and said she understood. She wasn't asking for closeness, just a clean break from the guilt she'd been carrying. When I told my father about the meeting later, he thanked me for handling it calmly. My mother didn't say much, but made a quiet effort to include both of us in small ways again, sending group messages, asking about our schedules, suggesting dinner without pressure. It was cautious peace, but peace nonetheless. Over the next few months, I started hearing about Rachel again, but this time from different sources. A cousin mentioned she'd started volunteering regularly at a community center and helping organize charity drives. My father said she'd stopped gossiping altogether and had been focusing on work. There was no showmanship in it, no exaggerated stories. She just seemed to be living quietly. The next family dinner came around in spring. Rachel arrived halfway through, early enough to show up, late enough not to draw attention. She greeted everyone politely, brought a small dessert, and sat beside my mother. Conversation stayed light. When it was time to leave, she helped with the dishes, thanked everyone, and slipped out before dessert was served. No tension, no awkwardness, just quiet civility where chaos used to live. After dinner, my father said it was good to see everyone acting like family again. My mother nodded, but didn't add anything. It wasn't celebration, it was relief. On the drive home that night, I thought about how different everything had become. There had been no grand moment of revenge, no dramatic downfall, no public confrontation. Rachel's reputation hadn't collapsed in one blow. It had faded piece by piece until there was nothing left to defend. She had built her own downfall one lie at a time, and when the truth finally caught up, silence was all it took to let it settle. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I realized there was nothing left unresolved. Rachel's apology hadn't erased what she'd done, but it had ended the cycle that had defined our family for so long. My parents didn't have to choose sides anymore. I didn't have to protect myself constantly, and Rachel didn't have to fight for attention that no one was taking from her in the first place. The full circle wasn't about forgiveness or punishment, it was about truth finding its own way out. In the end, I didn't win anything or lose anything. I just stopped trying to control what people saw, and let their actions speak for themselves. Rachel's peace came from accountability, mine came from silence, and for the first time, that was enough.